I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Scott Krzych, who teaches film and media studies at Colorado College. His teaching and research focuses on political media, documentary, psychoanalytic theory, and film philosophy. With Todd McGowan, he co-hosted the first two LAC conferences in 2016 and 2017 at Colorado College. His new book is Beyond Bias: Conservative Media, Documentary Form, and the Politics of Hysteria, available from Oxford University Press, 2021. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Follow him at Twitter at @skrzych. That's SKRZYCH at Twitter. As with all Rendering Unconscious podcast episodes, there is a video accompanying this episode at YouTube. Just visit Trapart Film's YouTube channel. That's TRAPART Film at YouTube, or search for Rendering Unconscious Podcast. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious: Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, from Trapart Books 2019. For more information, you can visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast at our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. That's VANESSA23CARL. Your support is very appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting Rendering Unconscious Podcast and all of my other creative endeavors.
I think I'm happy to start with kind of how I came to psychoanalysis, if that makes sense. So I was a first generation college student growing up in Southern California. I went to Cal State University Northridge thinking I was already interested in education, thinking that I wanted to be, a high school teacher, just had really no idea about higher education, right? And kind of what happens in the university settings. And I was an English major. And for me, the really kind of turning point in my career was taking a survey course, an introduction to literary theory, right? And the class just absolutely blew my mind. And I had a great instructor, Jack Fisher Solomon, who was a post-structuralist. And so, encountering all these different, schools of literary theory, Marxism, feminism, post-colonial theory, and psychoanalysis. And I think one of the, kind of major kind of orientations for me that came out of that experience and that would lead me to graduate school and then eventually to psychoanalysis was a very kind of straightforward pedagogical assignment that I think a lot of English instructors use, which is to assign a particular text and then require students to apply a variety of different theoretical lenses to the same text, right? Read this poem or short story or watch this film, and then offer a Marxist reading and then a feminist reading and then maybe a psychoanalytic reading and see how they differ. And I think that apart from just the gesture of learning these different theoretical lenses, what I really took away from that practice was that that changing the lens by which I read, right, didn't just change the interpretation, it actually ended up changing me, right? Both as a scholar, but you know, as a human being, right, in a broad sense of the word, that to read differently, to look for alternative forms of signification in a text, in a social political phenomenon, actually ends up changing the reader in the process. And so I think that insight for me was just, you know, paving the way for psychoanalysis and an engagement in psychoanalytic theory, which, you know, quite obviously takes an interest in the power of signification, of resignification, and the like. And so I eventually moved away from English and literary theory and moved more into film studies, film theory, which also was a kind of fruitful discipline to engage in psychoanalytic theory, since especially in the US, film departments really emerged in the academy at a time in which French philosophy, French theory, and psychoanalysis was so influential. And so I found, even though I was going to graduate school in the early 2000s, when psychoanalysis was not quite as prominent in film studies departments, it still was a, you know, a kind of viable area of study, and was I was lucky enough to find myself in a doctoral program that was steeped in continental philosophy and Lacanian psychoanalysis, and so that was that kind of, you know, sent me on my way, and here I am now.
Is that how you met Todd McGowan? Because I saw that you and Todd McGowan did the first Black conference together.
Yeah. So so how did that happen? I had a great committee at Oklahoma State University, great faculty, Brian Price, Megan Sutherland, Hugh Mannon, who's a great Lacanian film theorist. And they started a journal and a film theory conference called World Picture. And I've been reading Todd's book that was relatively new at the time, The End of Dissatisfaction. And, you know, I was, you know, a grad student who was trying to find his way, and thought, I'm going to invite this guy, Todd McGowan, to come to the conference. He ended up coming, giving a great paper at one of the opening sessions. And then we ended up doing a panel together on the topic of failure at the Society for Cinema and Media Studies with my dear friend and colleague Jason Landrum, and then once I got the job in film and media studies at Colorado College, I reached out to Todd again to have him give a talk when he was working on his comedy book. He came and gave a beautiful talk on Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. And I had heard that he and Hillary Neroni and Jennifer Friedlander and Henry Cripps, you know, were interested in putting on a conference, and we happened to have some funding at that time. And so it was just kind of this perfect mesh of kind of intersecting careers and interests and all that.
Very cool. Todd's the greatest. He's such a nice guy.
He is great. Mm-hmm.
And now you've just
one of the funniest people I've ever met.
Yeah, he's great. He's the whole package. Great, smart, funny, personable, open-minded.
And he'll deny all of those things if he happens to hear this.
Which he probably will. And now you have a new book, Beyond Bias.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, I grew up in a staunchly evangelical, politically conservative household. Rush Limbaugh was on the radio all the time in the car, you know, when my parents were driving me to school. Yeah, and so I've been interested in conservative media, right-wing politics, and discourse in the U.S. in particular. I'm a you know a bit of an Americanist in my kind of scholarly work. But around the time I was finishing graduate school, it was, again, a kind of fortuitous moment, at least for developing this project. It was around the time of the first midterm elections during the Obama administration, when the Tea Party kind of arose as this, a very prominent reactionary movement. And I think a moment in which Fox News and other conservative media outlets, kind of shifted from, what they had been doing for decades. Really, if we consider talk radio as maybe the starting point that then evolved into Fox News and then everything we have today. I think there's a kind of shift away from conservative political entertainment that had been typical of those outlets to a more kind of activist strain that you had, Fox News hosts organizing some of the rallies for the Republican candidates who would be part of that Tea Party wave that would really bring into the United States Congress a large group of some of the most kind of extreme right-wing politicians that we had seen in a long time. So that was kind of happening. Glenn Beck was the kind of most prominent host on Fox News at that time, and journalists were responding to Glenn Beck. If people recall, he would often break down crying in front of the camera. He would, do a lot of the kind of typical right-wing media talking points, but he would have all these chalkboards on his stage and go through all of his kind of conspiracy theories, but it was like highly affective, highly emotional. And so journalists at the time were really using the term hysteria to describe Glenn Beck. And of course, in a very, kind of conventional, even stereotypical use of the term, not at all with any psychoanalytic inflection. So those things were happening in the media, in the conservative media in particular. And then at the same time, in psychoanalytic theory, especially in Lacanian studies, I think we were seeing the kind of really productive response, especially in Anglophone departments and studies, of the response to the English translation of Seminar 17, where Lacan lays out his 4 discourses, including the hysterics discourse. So there was I think a kind of resurgence of an interest in hysteria through a lot of the scholarly work that was responding to the translation of Seminar 17, also just an interest in discourse theory. And so that was really, I think, the jumping off point for me of thinking about conservative political media as a kind of enactment of hysterical discourse.
Oh, can you say more about that?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess I'll try. I mean, I think as I was diving into the project, one thing I decided quite early on is I was not interested in the archive of talk radio or Fox News, which just seemed like impossible as an archive to get into. One could spend, a lifetime, tracking the kind of excess over-the-top rhetoric that appears on a daily basis, let alone like as websites like Breitbart, were emerging at that time. So I settled in on starting with conservative documentary films, which had kind of emerged in response and as an attempt to rebut the films of Michael Moore and the kind of the popularity of Michael Moore as this, over-the-top figure on the left who had such great success making political documentary. And it really kind of produced a cottage industry of right-wing documentary films that didn't seem to have an agenda of their own, except for erasing or counteracting the arguments of more prominent, documentary filmmakers like Michael Moore. And so that the kind of act of negation, of refusal, of rebuttal, was one of the first kind of tropes of the conservative documentary cycle that stood out to me as I dug into them, which as I was continuing to read in psychoanalytic theory, started to, I think, suggest some connections with a lot of the writing on hysteria and hysterical discourse. But I think what really crystallized that were a few really suggestive arguments by a few authors I was reading at the time. Joan Kopchak, in her hugely important and influential book Read My Desire, talked about democracy as a kind of hysterical political arrangement. She says at some point that democracy hystericizes the subject, that when we go into the voting booth, we're engaging in the arguably one of the most significant acts of political participation, right? To vote, to express our voice, to express our opinion. And yet at that very same moment, we become just one among millions of others, right? That at our most individual, we also become a part of the masses, right? And that's, I think, her way of expressing the link between democracy and then hysteria as a structure. And then I came across Juliet Mitchell's Mad Men and Medusas, Reclaiming Hysteria, that she published in 2000, where she just does this, beautiful kind of revision and close analysis of so many of Freud's case studies of hysteria, and notices what Freud didn't in each of those cases, examples of sibling rivalry, right? That, Dora and others were, I think, from Mitchell's perspective, experiencing these kind of hysterical breakdowns in part because of their familial situations of not knowing where they stand relative to their parents or caretakers because of the presence of a sibling. That Mitchell describes the sibling as the one who is like me and unlike me, right? We share a family name, we live in the same space, we share some DNA perhaps, or even a likeness. And yet also it's an antagonistic relationship oftentimes, right? That we may love and hate this person, our brother or sister, at the same time. And this is, I think, Mitchell's way of really expanding hysteria. She treats it as a universal possibility for subjective experience, and really explodes the way in which hysteria has been gendered historically, right? That anyone can become hystericized at any moment. And I think the way that Mitchell emphasized these kind of lateral relationships of someone who is like me and unlike me in the case of the sibling, and how that renders kind of unclear where I stand in the kind of family dynamic, to me seemed like a really interesting way to think about politics and to think about democracy, of what does it mean to live and inhabit, to live in a country where, our neighbors, might be Trump supporters or vote for Trump, or have, Trump signs in their front lawns. And so I think Mitchell's account, I think, was also really important for me in the development of the argument. And I think, I was a little resistant to, do we need one more book on hysteria or hysterical discourse? Obviously, in the archive of psychoanalytic theory, it's been talked about so much. But I think between, Kopchak, Mitchell, and a bunch of other psychoanalytic thinkers that I cite, I really was convinced by the idea that if psychoanalytic theory and practice is going to continue, right, that hysteria always has to be part of the conversation. Of course, this is where psychoanalysis for Freud begins, with hysterics. And so I think I just need to run with it.
Yeah, yes, we absolutely need more books on hysteria. And also, like, this book uses it in a very way of this moment, so that's different than other things coming out or that have come out.
I hope so.
And also, I feel like what some people understand, but a lot of people don't understand about hysteria is it's always going to exist, because no matter how much you box people in or try to change the narrative to be more inclusive or more exclusive or whatever, the hysteria within all of us is always going to like try to rupture that, try to find new ways, try to find ways around it, and try to break things down or break out of these kinds of structures. So it's really necessary to like to the process.
Yeah, and I think a few people have talked about this, right? That the hysteria is always kind of providing us with the symptom of the times, right? And that's why I think in more mainstream psychology, it's kind of been pushed to the side, if not entirely negated, right, as a diagnostic term, in part because it's always shifting and changing, right? The hysterical symptoms is kind of evolutionary, right? Or it's a de-evolutionary would be the better term, right? It's about kind of resisting certain, I think, socio-cultural political developments, and I think that's to me what I hope is illuminating about putting in conversation the canon of psychoanalytic considerations of hysteria and hysterical discourse with the conservative media that I engage here, is that I think it is conservative media, or at least of the form that I engage with, is de-evolutionary. It is depoliticizing. That each of the chapters and each of the cycles of films that I look at are really about negating the arguments of their opponents, not so much about taking an active political position, but actually by refusing to take a position, by performing what looks and sounds like political argumentation or debate, but is instead just a kind of I think a gesture of what Jacques Rancière calls noise, right? Of just to confuse things, to complicate things so that we can't get anywhere. And I think the conservative reactions to climate change is a perfect example of that. That I think the mainstream conservative politicians and pundits and opinion makers rarely will go so far as to say that climate change isn't happening, or that it's Trump would, I think, called it a hoax at some point, but I don't think of Trump as a hysteric. I think more often the argument is like, well, we don't really know enough. We need to keep studying these things. Maybe a warming planet will be a good thing for agriculture. Maybe things will change. We need to know more. It's this kind of refusal to take a position that I think in the case of climate science and the kind of politics necessary to respond to the climate crisis has been unfortunately quite effective for their side. Again, especially in the US, of preventing any kind of viable democratic movement towards reshaping our society and our economy in a way that would be actually, I think, necessary to address this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I feel anytime I hear them talking. It's like, what are they saying? They're saying nothing. Like, what are they saying? It's just these like talking points getting thrown around and like mixed together in different orders. Yeah, it reminds me also like when you hear the QAnon people talking, it's just this like rotation of memes that are like connecting in this like kind of associative, like clang association manner, and they just like keep going around and around and around. It doesn't really, it's saying nothing.
Yeah. And I think I would kind of place the media objects that I engage somewhere kind of between the most extreme conspiracy theorists and theories that circulate online, like QAnon, and then maybe more towards kind of the moderate Republican politicking that do have a kind of active agenda, whether that's increasing military spending or limiting access to abortion or building the wall or whatever else, that between kind of the most horrifying conspiracy theories and then I think more kind of moderate Republican politics, you have, I think, this really influential form of hysterical media that is really just about knocking back, right, more kind of progressive policies and ideas that are emerging from the left, right? So denying climate change, one of the examples I use in the book is that, against Black Lives Matters, the response that all lives matter, right? Which is, lots of people have pointed out that there is no, active political policy in favor of all lives, right? No one is actually, out there protesting in favor of all lives. The slogan is just a kind of attempt to perform a response, right? But the very performance of that response is, again, depoliticizing. It kind of copies an existing, quite active and important and influential movement, right, for Black lives, and then just throws out something that kind of muddies the water, right? Like, what does all lives matter mean? What is it for? And I think, to take it back to the clinic, which is something that I am, I think, really interested throughout the book to try to lean into, kind of carefully and respectfully, as someone who, is still, kind of an academic, a film scholar who is not a clinician, but nevertheless finds a lot of insight and inspiration from, I think, especially the current era of especially Lacanian practitioners who are writing and publishing these days. One of the ways the hysteric is often described in the clinic is someone who is giving to the analyst, kind of performing the symptom, whatever symptoms the hysteric believes the analyst is looking for, right? So that, through the performance of the symptom, if the analyst falls for that trap, right, of making a diagnosis, that the hysteric will thereby, avoid any real actual, analytic engagement, right? And Freud talks about Dora in this way, that Dora is offering all these, her own kind of conspiracy theories about her father and Frau K, and all of the unusual ways in which the families are ending up in the same cities at the same time. And Freud says he absolutely believes everything that she's saying, right? That what might sound like conspiracy theories are in fact probably accurate. But then Freud says, nevertheless, she's offering all of these kind of points of data and information so that an analysis can never actually get going, right? To kind of fill that time, to give Freud something to chew on, to distract him. And I found, really, like, throughout the films I look at, this overwhelming use of information, data, arguments, constant different opinions, all on the kind of the reactionary side of things, but never arriving at a kind of coherent political argument. And I think that's to me one of the hallmarks of hysterical discourse, is that so much is thrown at the listener or the viewer that we don't even know where we stand or what we're hearing. But that is actually, just as it's, I think, kind of psychically beneficial for the hysteric who in the clinic, is also cynically beneficial for I think, right-wingers who don't have any science or evidence or facts to back up their position. So it's better to just muddy the waters, right? And not that they're necessarily doing it on purpose, but I think it works out nonetheless.
Yeah, it's also, I had forgotten the Tea Party. I had repressed them, but really they seem to have become like the main, like, Republican stance. Whereas when they first popped up, they seemed like so extreme, and now it's like seems like the norm on the right, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, unfortunately, you're right. It's both become more of the norm, and it continues, right, with COVID denial, with I think the strategic production of mass hysteria. And I think that's the appropriate word, around critical race theory. And, we live in a school district here in Colorado that just, outlawed the teaching of critical race theory in elementary schools. And of course, critical race theory was not being taught in elementary school. So they're banning something that doesn't exist. It's certainly not in the way that they describe it. And they're banning, books and theories and ideas that they haven't read, which I think is, again, horrifying and quite scary.
Yeah, that is terrifying. I'm a bit removed from that being in Sweden, but I've heard like bits of this popping up. I don't really
Mhm.
understand the full thing that's happening with it right now.
No one does, right? But I think that's part of the point. Is like what's actually happening? Like all of a sudden, at least on my Facebook feed, and and I'm still interested in conservative media and continuing to work on this. And so I unfortunately do subscribe and follow kind of prominent conservative outlets, so I kind of see it on a daily basis. But like all of a sudden, there are just parents going to school board meetings across the country yelling at school board members for teaching critical race theory, or yelling at them for maybe requiring masks during a pandemic. And it is really strange to watch, because it's like they clearly don't know what they're talking about. And then as we're as watching from a distance, I don't know what they're talking about. And yet at the same time, legislation is being passed, right? The prevents schools, right, from requiring masks, or prevents the teaching of an important discipline.
Yeah, I'm from Florida originally, and so that's really the only kind of section of the news in the States I've been following, which is enough. And yeah, the governor there is actually like actively like taking money away from schools, like defunding, or saying he will defund schools if they require masks.
Right, right. Well, and I think that's it seems like we're maybe again another moment, another development in these issues, where now you have Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, who signing legislation exclusively on Fox News, right, and seeming to legislate or to kind of develop his executive orders, strictly as a kind of performance for the kind of Fox News, Newsmax, Breitbart audience, right? Which is a whole other kind of scary.
How do we make politics not this like entertainment? Like it's so depressing that things are done for ratings instead of like their integrity or value.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. And I think it's probably the question that I don't know that I can answer it, but I believe quite strongly that it's the question that those of us working in psychoanalysis are kind of the best prepared to answer, right? To recognize that politics entails enjoyment, right? And that I think one of the things that has made in the U.S. especially, but I think also in the rise of kind of right wing populist movements around the globe is that a lot of these leaders are, and I'm certainly not the first to notice this, are really taking advantage in a cynical manner with the fact that enjoyment drives us, right? And recognize, and I think without knowing it, recognizing that jouissance, as we well know, as this kind of mixture of pain and pleasure, is a kind of galvanizing force for these movements that we definitely saw under Trump. And the anti-immigrant rhetoric with which he began his campaign, and all the stuff around building the wall. So I think that's something that we should take seriously. I think also that just as those who are working in psychoanalysis, whether theoretically or in the clinic, I think have to keep continually pushing against mainstream psychology, and reminding psychology of the importance of the unconscious. For instance, I think for those of us working in culture, need to remind academics and journalists of the centrality of enjoyment, right, to the political sphere. That I think there is still a tendency in kind of trade books and in journalism to still dismiss the right for their ignorance, for their nonsense, for their stupidity. And I think and this is I think another central argument of the book, is that relies on a fantasy of common sense, right? That there is some sort of symbolic structure that we could all, hold on together and agree to. And so I think this is why I try not to, even though I'm maybe doing it a bit in this conversation, I try not to denigrate these films as stupid, as nonsensical, or whatever else, right? And to really embrace the analytical stance that if we're going to produce a change, right, I think we need to step away from our moral judgments of trying to, reproduce, whatever is commonsensical for us in the other, right? Whether that's our political opponent or the analysand, that really avoids, I think, the necessary trauma in this case of democratic antagonism. That this is, to my mind, an unavoidable feature of democratic engagement. That there are people with whom we may have to interact who just share nothing in common with us, right? But who may nevertheless become ascendant, may have their candidate win the presidency, even if their candidate knows almost absolutely nothing about anything, right? And so that's where I think, I'm quite biased in this way, that psychoanalysis is like all the more necessary, and it's also why I'm just so glad to see just the wonderful collection of interviews that you've done here and that are appear in other podcast networks for the psychoanalytically inclined. That I think it's really an important and necessary framework, both for this moment.
Yeah, that's exactly why I'm doing it, because I really feel like psychoanalytic thinking can help people think in more nuanced ways and think about things in different ways, and not, like you said, it's not just, we can't just think of everything in an intellectual way, or like, oh, well, if we just teach people to change their behaviors, or if we just teach people to think of it this way, or reframe their thinking, or whatever, or educate them. It's like, that's not how it works. Like, there are drives happening. People are getting off. We say enjoy, but like, people are getting off on this,
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
that's a hard thing to contend with. And we need to like keep that in mind when we're working with these issues.
Yeah. I have a chapter where I look at religious documentaries, and Bill Maher has this documentary called Religulous, where he goes and just kind of makes fun of these religious fundamentalists who were quite influential in the late 90s, early 2000s, helping to get George W. Bush elected. And I think the film is so unhelpful, and it's kind of, again, denigration of the beliefs of others, right? And even as I am, again, like horrified by, again, the kind of ascendancy of Trump, of the Tea Party, whatever else, of religious fundamentalists like Mike Pence in the vice presidency and whatever else, I think it just kind of does a disservice to understanding politics and the political, understanding the nature of subjectivity, to just disregard belief in whatever form that it takes, right, as somehow correctable or revisable, if only we could read the right books or watch the right documentaries. And so, I think one of the major gestures I'm trying to make in Beyond Bias is number one, to get away from the claims of bias in our accounts of political media, right? Like, of course, everyone's biased, and of course, right-wing media is highly biased. But one way to think about bias for me is the kind of constitutive split in subjectivity, right? The Lacan especially talks so much about, right? That we are all divided subjects, and I don't think that means that. I don't think that leads to like absolute relativism, that you believe what you want and I believe what I want, and we'll just see what happens. But I think it is important to get away from the moral denigration, right? That I think is also central to the way that the left often gets off, especially in our kind of favorite. A lot of our favorite media outlets, right? I mean, the Daily Show really isn't as popular as it once was, but the kind of left personalities like Keith Olbermann, Jon Stewart, John Oliver right now, who give us these lovely speeches on their shows about how awful our opponents are, and I think that's another kind of expression of enjoyment that's not terribly helpful.
Yeah, exactly. I often think like when people are like, how can they think that? Or just like, yeah, denigrating other people. I often think, well, they think the same thing about you, you know, like they feel just as strongly, like,
Right.
how can you think that? And also like when people are wanting to like change somebody else's mind in this like argumentative way, it's like that's not gonna work. And it's not gonna work if someone yells at you about something either. So it's like people on all sides feel similarly, I think.
Yeah, well, and that's where I think, I hope in a small way, that I can kind of contribute to these discussions and to think about the way psychoanalytic theory needs to continue to, rethink its tenets and evolve as the times evolve. The way Freud talked about that, as as many of his central claims became popularized, that it became harder to engage in clinical practice. If someone comes into analysis and believes they have an Oedipal complex, all of a sudden the positions that the analyst can take are a bit more circumscribed. And so I think that's a kind of important takeaway of applying psychoanalytic theory to these cultural phenomenon is not that we just fit these new social and political formations into pre-established psychoanalytic categories, but rather we kind of continue to shift and develop those categories in response to these events.
I like that. And you said something in the beginning that I want to talk more about because you talked about
Yeah.
learning in like literary theory how you took the same text and like looked at it through all these different lenses, and it just made me envious, like, oh, I wish I had gotten to do that in graduate school. Because my schooling was like very very clinical. I have a PsyD, so it's like literally just like clinical work. It's not like philosophy so much or anything like that. But I mean, of course, there was psychological theory. But I did have one supervisor that taught us to look at patients that way. Like, okay, first look at this
Mm.
patient like in a purely behavioral way. How would you treat them? Totally just behavior based, and then cognitively, like CBT based. What would you do? And then think of them like in an existential model. And think of them from a Freudian like drive theory. Think of them from object relations theory, like that. And I found that so incredibly useful, and it also made me see that like all of these things are right in their way. Like I see how all of these perspectives exist and how they're all like looking at different parts of the person and treating that. But then I guess people get so like narrow minded that they just think like one is the correct way to look at someone rather than like trying to be more holistic.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because I don't really announce this in the book, but I think I think it may come across to folks who are well versed in kind of the different psychoanalytic schools, is that I was kind of interested in bringing together um, psychoanalytic work that's in literary theory and cultural studies and film theory, but also bringing in some the work of practitioners. I talk a little about Christopher Bolus, in his book on hysteria. Juliet Mitchell, is already kind of in the middle, anyways. But folks like Patricia Garavici, Danny Nobis, Bruce Fink, and not to say that I'm certainly not the first person to working in literary or film studies to cite prominent practitioners, but I think it is really important, and I'm convinced that it can be useful to take a more holistic approach, right? Like I find a lot of insight in Lacan's account of hysterical discourse. But I also still find insight in kind of the French feminist movement, around folks like Sisu and Irigaray and Kristeva and their accounts of hysterical discourse as a form of viable protest, right? That I think there's this really important moment in the 70s and 80s when feminism and psychoanalysis are so intimately linked, and the valorization of political protest before one yet has a vocabulary for what one is protesting against. That when hysteria is used as a denigrating term, right? That in the stereotypical way, this woman doesn't know what she's talking about, as it's been used historically, or as a denigration of populist movements, of these people don't know what they're talking about. That I think a lot of the folks that I cite in the book point to hysteria as this necessary moment of breakdown, and that one should sometimes protest even if one doesn't yet know what one is asking for. And that's again, and Lacan says this too, this is a necessary point of breakdown in the analysis where nothing makes sense anymore, right? And I think that can be highly useful, both like interpersonally and also politically. And I think we saw that with the protests against Trump in 2016. But then I think that's also where we need and can benefit from clinicians who are dealing with hysterical patients, you know, on a sometimes daily basis, and to recognize that hysteria can be again a kind of useful breakthrough moment, but it also can be the means for a cyclical repetition that prevents change, progress, or development.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to learn to listen to what it's saying. Try to listen to it instead of just like, yeah, trying to control it. You kind of have to let it play out a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, if nothing else, that's, I think, the service I'm trying to provide, is because folks often come up to me when they hear about the work and they're like, how did you sit through this? How did you watch these films? Like, I could never, you know, I tried once to watch, you know, a Dinesh D'Souza film, you know, on Obama, and I got 5 minutes in and couldn't do any more, right? These are the kinds of things that I hear. And I think that's, again, where, I mean, I'm drawing a little bit from my biography, in that I grew up with this kind of media in the car, in the living room. And so in some sense, I'm kind of, you know, used to it. But I think that's also, I think, the analytic stance of being willing to listen to things that you know, may horrify us, and yet not sitting with that from the analyst side, right? You know, I imagine that this is the case, that one's not going to have a kind of impactful treatment if you're letting your personal kind of opinions and viewpoints and perspectives as an analyst, you know, come into the session.
Exactly.
I hope I'm getting it somewhat right. I don't know.
Yeah, I like it. I had something else that popped in my head, but now it's gone. Well, I guess it's still Friday, whether I only had one patient today or not.
Totally. I know.
What are you working on now?
What am I? So I'm still, you know, a little, you know, interested in this material. I don't want to become like, you know, I don't want my entire career to center on right-wing media. I think that would just that would be too depressing. But I am interested in the moment, at especially the kind of response to COVID and the denial of COVID as a pandemic. And I think it's a kind of interesting, slightly different case. I don't know if it's hysterical, but I think what interested me in the documentaries, the conservative documentaries that I take up in the book, is this kind of refusal to participate in democratic debate, right? Even as they're making films that look as if they're debating, again, climate change, the you know, capitalism and the economy after 2008, what to do about, you know, systemic racism. You know, for every, you know, contemporary political topic, there's a conservative documentary film that's talking about it. But at the end of the day, the argument kind of boils down to, there's nothing to see here. There's really nothing to talk about. There's no real problems in society. Everything's fine. You know, the only real problem are people like, you know, Michael Moore or Barack Obama, who tell us that we need to change things, right? That's I think the move that they make. And so I'm interested in this kind of refusal to participate, this kind of withdrawal from political engagement that I think has played out in really troubling and impactful ways during COVID, of this, you know, just refusal to believe the science, or refusal to wear masks. I think what I'm most interested in the moment is this particular kind of algorithmic argument that boils down to the phrase "with, not from." And this is the argument that lots of people may have died with COVID in their system, but they didn't die from COVID. Is the kind of conservative argument, is that, well, yeah, people might have been dying from the virus, but it was really other, maybe they had a heart condition or something else that's the real explanation. So it's this way of kind of picking away at the data, and that allows them to argue that, COVID isn't more deadly than the flu, that then as that is picked up in the conservative media with kind of other just denigrations of in the US of Anthony Fauci or whoever else, that I think then produces situations where people are going unmasked, not getting the vaccine. And it's the one way I describe it is, what if we had a pandemic and no one showed up, right? Like there's a way in which, and I have family in Oklahoma, which is a very conservative state here, where, when I visited over the summer, it was almost as if this thing had never happened, right? That they're just kind of going about their lives. And I think, I don't blame it all on conservative media, but I think at least, the media that a lot of those people consume certainly contributes to their, again, refusal to accept kind of what's right in front of them.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even videos of like people dying in the hospital that are still talking about how they don't believe in the virus when they're dying from it.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a way in which, what's often referred to as the echo chamber of conservative media, really produces a kind of separate ideological, political, epistemological universe that is really hard to break through if you're an outsider, right? Like it's I think they really are speaking a different language, if not like just a whole different kind of I don't know if I like this word, but species, right? Like it's almost like there's no point
Like a
of
different
connection.
reality, yeah.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So, Trump.
Yeah.
Stephen Reisner talked about Trump, and maybe I'll have his talk. It was when he was first elected.
Yeah.
And he gave a talk about the people making fun of Trump and saying like how stupid he was or what an idiot he was or these kinds of things, and not taking what he was doing seriously. And what a problem that is, because clearly he has a lot of power and is affecting a lot of people and things and causing a lot of devastation in ways, and to not take that seriously, no matter like by just denigrating that person, it's just doing a disservice to everyone. And he gave a talk on it at the New School. I guess it must have been early 2017, and maybe I'll have it be an episode after this so that people can hear it, or I'll definitely link to it. Called "Crazy Like a Fox," and he's like, is somebody, that was the other thing. He's either stupid or he's crazy, right? But like, is somebody really delusional or psychotic if they are able to somehow like make us all then like live in this delusion of theirs? Like what is that exactly?
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. And yeah, Trump is such a hard, kind of figure to place. I mean, I do think that I don't know, there seems something, kind of perverse, or a kind of perverse structure in Trump. Not just the way that like he promotes, kind of his pleasure, but I think more at the level of disavowal and of the kind of recognition that there are certain rules that exist, but without a kind of commitment to follow them, that I think is really interesting. I'm seeing kind of more and more, discussion of perversion as a social structure. I think after Trump, I think for good reason. I do think that Trump quite clearly, hystericized the left, right? And that, and rightly so, right? And that's why I think we should, I probably, for you and for listeners of this podcast, we don't need to, clarify that hysteria is not necessarily a denigrative or derogative term, right? But I think the way that Trump has had and continues to have, this power and influence, while also, I think, quite clearly not knowing what he's talking about most of the time, right? That this barred big other, this lacking big other, right? If one is, subjected to having to live under his presidency, or to, live in a globe where he is, commander in chief of the kind of a American military industrial complex, that can be, I think, reasonably hystericizing. And so, but I think where, just to kind of to bring it back to or how I flip it in the book, is that this is, I think, what conservative media is often trying to do in its kind of political gestures of to make the other, the master, whatever kind of language you want to use, lacking, right? That of finding anything that allows us to kind of escape from, say, the authority of science, or of the fact that that sometimes Democrats win elections and maybe we should figure out a way to compromise or something else. That I think they are often trying to produce the very same scenario that a lot of us had to live with under Trump, this kind of hysterical, why is this person in charge? They don't actually know what they're doing.
Yeah, and what's going on with the US that he could become in charge?
Yeah, absolutely.
Shouldn't people have to have some sort of background check or credit check? We have to have them for everything else. I had to have one to become a psychologist. Why don't they have to have one to be the president?
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. And not that we have to, as someone who grew up evangelical, I can't stop evangelizing for whatever, my kind of system of beliefs. But again, like, I think we need psychoanalysis to explain these kind of trans-subjective phenomenon, right? That in some sense, and again, like, I think as a lot of people have noted, it wasn't just, Trump the person, I think, is less important than the kind of social and political structure that would allow for someone like that to rise to power.
Yeah, exactly. Because he's the master of saying nothing. It's just like, I think that, like, whatever it was, like, person, man, woman, person, TV camera, was like the epitome of that. It's like, what is happening?
Sarah Cooper on TikTok, am I getting the name right? Who's have you seen that, the TikTok where
I'm not on TikTok yet.
Well, it's on YouTube, but yeah, there's a I think the comedian's name is Sarah Cooper. I might be getting it wrong, but I've watched her version of Trump doing that man person TV camera so many times. Right?
I'll have to look that up. I can link to that too.
Yeah, check it out.
And the other thing with, like, the COVID denial is, like, why do they want to kill their own, like, base? Like, these are the people that are voting for them. I don't understand that at all.
Yeah. I have family members who have had COVID, who were not careful, who are refusing to get the vaccine. So I see it just happening in the news, but I've also just seen it in my personal life. And yeah, I think it's just the case that from a variety of factors, from upbringing to media intake to, in some cases, religious affiliation, that they just honestly disbelieve in the science, right? And again, that's where I try not to be judgmental. I think that my manner of enjoyment, one of the things that I enjoy so much that again, like, happened when I got to the university, is that I just love expertise. I'm, like, taken in by expert knowledge, right? And so I enjoy going to colloquia on campus, from my colleagues in the natural sciences, and to hear what they're up to, and I'm just like amazed by the positive outcomes of expert knowledge and research and whatever else. But I also want to recognize that that's kind of my affective orientation, right? I'm taken in with expertise, while also recognizing experts can be wrong and also do terrible things. I'm not naive that way, but I think there is a way in which, in part, due to kind of conservative media, and especially in the US, there's still kind of remnants and kind of active politicization of religious fundamentalism, really a denial of any expertise that doesn't come from within the circle, right? That they'll believe their pastor and what their pastor has to say about COVID or a pandemic before, epidemiologists. Again, I think we should take that seriously. Like, I don't really understand the science of climate change. I just kind of trust,
the experts.
Right? And I mean, I watch the documentary films, and I don't feel like I just believe in it because people say it. I think there's so much data and research to back it up,
and experience. You can see it happening with the fires, and being from Miami with the huge increase of hurricanes. They used to be so rare when I was a kid, and now it's just like every year there's something.
Yeah. I mean, we're really watching it happen before our eyes, which is it is scary.
Yeah, the thing I like being around people when they're doing the thing that they love to do, which actually you saying like what you like, it's like, that's also this podcast, that's why I'm like, I just want to hear people talk about what they're into, because I'm into that. I'm into listening to people talk about what they're into or do what they're into. Like, if a friend has some sort of thing they like to perform or music or whatever, I'm not really particular about what the music is or the performance or the art or whatever. I just like love people doing whatever they love to do. That makes me happy. So.
Right. No, I think it was great. And I think what a great kind of ethic to follow for a podcast. And, we started talking about LAC and Todd and some of the other organizers, but that was my experience when we first did the LAC conference. Is I've never seen a building of academics and scholars and practitioners so happy. Right. It was, especially in the context where, folks who are working in philosophy and literature and political theory, where psychoanalysis isn't quite as prominent or valued as it maybe once was, that to gather all of these people into a single building, everybody was just happy to be together and to talk and to give their papers, and it was quite fun. And the LAC conference is continuing on and is in Vermont this coming April. Well, fingers crossed. I
saw that 2022.
Yeah. So I'm hopeful to go, and I'm glad not to organize. I helped organize the first two, and then it was at Clark University last time, and then the University of Vermont coming up, and it's a lot more fun to just go and participate.
You can just enjoy it.
enjoy the Lacanian love. It's a weird, beautiful thing.
It's a fun group of people. Thank you to all of the philosophers and literary majors and film theorists for keeping psychoanalysis alive, because psychology sure tried to kill it, and the psychoanalytic institutes as well. So.
Well, do you have a sense of this? Like, I mean, this is just to like get off topic a little bit. I do feel like it's a kind of interesting moment where so many of the books on my desks, right, are, I think practicing analysts who are, really producing new audiences, right? I'm thinking of like Jameson Webster and Patricia Garavici, Derek Hook, and so many that you've had on your podcast. Like, is there something happening? Like, or is it just that I'm pre-selecting, the kind of the best work that's happening in kind of cultural theory and analysis and all that? Do you have a take on that?
I think it's a good moment for psychoanalysis. Like I think you said before we started recording, because I think people are tired of like the mainstream medical model of diagnosis and being medicated and over medicated and put into all these boxes and told how they are. And like sometimes of course a label can be helpful to help someone like understand like, oh, there's other people that also feel this way and things like that, but like it's too much. And I think people are kind of yearning for, at least but I also know my sphere is very esoteric, because in my experience people seem to be like yearning for these like more nuanced ways of looking for things and like more sophisticated ways, not being so reactionary and just like being stuck in this binary back and forth argument, that's just very reactive. but trying to look at like multiple ways of functioning or looking at things in the world. But I also only talk to like psychoanalysts, people from the podcast, people coming in for psychoanalysis. So they're all pretty like insight oriented people that are like searching and trying to learn and things like that. So
yeah, I have just the benefit and the luck of ending up at Colorado College, where we have a minor in psychoanalysis. And we have, my colleague in philosophy, John Riker, writes on self-psychology. Jonathan Lee, who's a Lacanian, who wrote a book on Lacan in the 90s. Marcia Dobson, who's a Jungian and also a practicing analyst. And we actually teach a class in Los Angeles at the Contemporary Institute of Psychoanalysis, and meet with analysts who talk about their practices. And they don't seem to understand like what happens when I want to talk about film and media and culture. And they're like, they don't really know what to say about that. But yeah, for any folks, I'm trying to set up a course in New York at some point in the next couple of years to do the same thing, like kind of bring my kind of literary and cinematic interests in psychoanalytic theory, but also meet with some of the kind of open-minded practitioners there and have those conversations. So if anyone's
are you on the Unbehagen listserv?
On the what?
Unbehagen?
No,
I'll put you on the Unbehagen listserv, so I will tell you what Unbehagen is. So basically, Jameson and I went to the same Psychoanalytic Institute and had complaints. And Jameson and Michael Garfinkel, who I've interviewed from the podcast as well, they were a year ahead of me, and they had even more complaints. And they wrote a letter to the school, which I can link to, like kind of voicing their complaints and like the ways that they thought could be useful in training psychoanalysts. And of course, we're completely shut down and nothing happened. And people pretended to have meetings, but it didn't really come to anything. So basically, we all ended up leaving that institute, and they both ended up going and training at IPTAR and finishing there. And I went and got a Lacanian analyst and a Lacanian supervisor and a Lacanian study group and finished that way. And so we realized, like, before we officially kind of left, that we knew a lot of these analysts that we've been reading. A lot of these people are living, like you're saying, that we're reading, and there's a lot of great psychoanalytic literature coming out. And just being in New York, everybody kind of passes through New York at some point or another. So we knew people from going to their lectures and then like going out to dinner afterwards and stuff like that, networking in that way. So we realized, like, when you're in an institute, I don't know if people realize this because not everyone's been in institutional training, but if you want to do anything, you want to present a talk or anything, everything has to be approved. There's boards that have to look at it and be like, yes or no, that you can do this or that. And it's so frustrating. And of course, I'm really into like art and psychoanalysis, and I'd be like, look at this great paper, this idea, and they're just like, no. Like, what is this? This doesn't have anything to do with psychoanalysis. I'm like, okay. So we realized, like, instead of having to go through all these boards and like asking all these like dinosaurs for permission of what we can and cannot talk about, like, why don't we just go directly to the analysts that we love to read and like see if, like, say somebody like Danny Nobis is coming to talk at Columbia University, and like, he's getting paid to do that or whatever, and maybe he'll like spend an evening while he's in New York talking to our group of like, up and coming analysts or early career clinicians or whatever you want to call us, and see, and most people do, because they want to talk to students, they want to talk to people that want to learn and listen, they're interested in that. So basically we just started doing that, and everybody was like, yeah, we'll come talk to you. And so we started this group that we called Das Unbehagen, which came from Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, because we were the discontent in the civilization of psychoanalytic institutes. And that was back in 2012. And our first speaker was Otto Kernberg, and he's a pretty big analyst, and I'd been reading him, in grad school and everything, and we were really surprised but happy that he agreed to come, because we couldn't pay these people, but we were really surprised and happy that he came to talk to us. And then we learned in preparing for his talk that he actually had written papers about like how psychoanalytic institutes kill the creativity of psychoanalytic candidates. Because if you want to do anything like new or innovative, it's just all like shut down. Like they just want you to like learn how to be like whatever their master is of their institute, basically. And the institute I went to had been, everybody in that institute had been trained by Charles Brenner. And Charles Brenner, you know, he's an analyst and he hasn't had an idea that was interesting, which was like compromise formation. It's basically like, you know, you have the inner id things and you have the outer reality, and like basically everything you do in Brenner's idea is a compromise formation between, you know, your inside impulses and outer reality. And he thinks your ego is that, you know, every action you take is that, everything is a compromise formation. And it's like, okay, I get that. That doesn't take that long to learn. You know, like I got that idea, but literally, like, do I need to learn that for 4 years straight? You know, it's just like there has to be something else to psychoanalysis besides that. You know, that's how I felt. So I made through like three. I almost made it to the end of the third year that I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Especially because Jameson was already studying with David Lichtenstein, and he was at CUNY teaching like grad students in psychology, psychoanalysis. And so she asked him to come to the institute, and they taught a class together like in the evening that was like something you could take additionally to the regular kind of course that they had us on. And then once I started learning Lacan from David Lichtenstein and Jameson, it was just like, forget it. Like, I can't even listen to this anymore, you know? It's just like, yeah, we're back to dreams and language and the cut and slips and all the things that Freud talked about. Like, that's what's interesting. That's the unconscious coming through. So yeah, put you on the Dawson hook and listserv, and then you can just talk to people there about it. I mean, there's like 1,000 people on there, but there's a lot of people in New York on there. Jameson and Patricia and all these people you've named are on there, and so you can always like talk to them and like organize something that way to make it happen. That was our whole point as well. It's like, whatever anybody wants to do, we want to help you make it happen. So if you have an idea, you like bring it to the group, and then whoever else is interested in making it happen. Like when we were all in New York together, like when I was there, it'd be like, okay, well, who can get a room? You know, somebody works at the New School, somebody works at NYU, somebody can get a room at a library. You know, we just like find a room, get flyers together, you know, tell the network about it to promote people's events, and then people would show up. So it was like basically supporting this idea of supporting everybody in whatever they wanted to do that had to do with psychoanalysis.
I'm so glad to hear all of this. Thank you for that. And I'm glad that this now has become about like my course preparation for next year. But it's I mean, one of the weird things about like at Colorado College, we teach on this block plan where we teach one class at a time, and students take one class at a time for a month. And so, you know, rather than dividing up between different, you know, disciplines, taking 4 classes, you know, in a semester, it's just one thing at a time, which makes it like really manageable to get up and teach a course really anywhere in the world for a month at a time. And so this is one of the things I'm interested in, is you know, to take a group of undergraduates, you know, to New York, or like what we've done in LA.
Oh, that's so cool. And how immersive. They could really be immersed in that subject.
Yeah, for sure. And it worked out amazing when we were at the Institute in Los Angeles, where, you know, we would read, you know, articles by the analysts who are affiliated with the Institute, and then be able to come in and chat with them. It's a lot of fun.
Wonderful. Well, I will add you to Umbaha.
Of course, mind-blowing for the students. Yeah. Thank you.
Make it happen. That's what we're all about. Making whatever you want happen.
That's right.
Because we don't need an authority to tell us what we can and cannot do, and we don't need to ask for permission.
Kids, but, that's not what I tell my kids, especially when they're not going to bed. But yes, I think the rest of the time, absolutely.
For adults.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Scott Krzych. For more, check out his book, Beyond Bias, Conservative Media, Documentary Form, and the Politics of Hysteria, available from Oxford University Press, 2021. Follow him at Twitter at @skrych. That's SKRZYCH. at Twitter. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. And now, there is only one libido, from the album This Is Voyeurism, a collaboration I did with Pete Murphy, available at Bandcamp. Just visit highbrowlowlife.bandcamp.com. In gender, sex, and the sexual, Jean Laplanche differentiated gender, sex, and sexuality in the following way. Gender is plural. It is oftentimes seen as dual, as in masculine, feminine, but it is not so by nature. It is actually plural, existing on a continuum. Sex is dual. It is so by virtue of sexual reproduction, and also by virtue of its human symbolization, which sets and freezes the duality as presence, absence, or phallic, castrated. The sexual is multiple, polymorphous. It is the object of psychoanalysis. Sexuality and the unconscious may be seen as one and the same. Sexuality is subversive. Sexual identity may change over a person's lifetime or circumstances. Sexuality is fluid and does not have prescribed objective, or path. The drive doesn't work on the whole person or body, but rather is focused on fragments or individual activities. There is only one libido, and therefore there is no psychic representative of the opposition, masculine, feminine, in the unconscious. The subject is inserted into her sexual nature. Sexuality precedes ego or identity. Any attempts to grasp onto identity may be seen as grappling with sexuality. Our intrinsic sexual nature. In an attempt to categorize it, restrict it, and contain it, give it a limit in an effort to control it. Normalization is pathological. We see the erotic object through the obstacle. be it a door or glass. And this is voyeurism.